thanks to Brad and Lissa and everyone at Politics and Prose. This is actually the sixth book I've talked about at Politics and Prose, 6 out of 6, going back to a book called, my first book, Beijing Jeep, in 1989, when Politics and Prose had just opened, and I had brown hair, and newspapers were thriving, and Barack Obama was a second-year law student. So, I mean, really, people ask me, how do you write a book? And I say, and this is all true, I mean, you spend a couple years on research. You stay up at night figuring out how to do the research. You spend a couple years writing. And then you spend some time thinking about what you're going to say about it at Politics and Prose. As Brad mentioned, this book grew naturally out of my previous book, Rise of the Vulcans, about George W. Bush's foreign policy team. And lots of people think now, understandably, but not quite accurately, that the Vulcans book was about neoconservatives or about hawks like Cheney and Rumsfeld. It's not exactly true. It was really about all of the people in the George W. Bush administration, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and then rivals, Colin Powell and Richard Armitage, who had risen with them inside the Republican Party. And despite all the differences among these members of the previous administration, they shared some common traits and beliefs. All of them had backgrounds in the military or in the Pentagon. And this was as true of the Secretary of State, who had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Richard Armitage, as it was of Cheney and Rumsfeld. It's rare to have an administration with two former secretaries of defense. And they also shared some common beliefs. America was unquestionably a force for good in the world. Military power was of supreme importance. And in fact, the disagreements among them were how and when force should be used by the United States. Should it be saved for big wars or used as it was in Iraq? So immediately after Obama's election in 2008, I decided I wanted to take a look at the Democrats over the same time period. Really, many of my books have covered the same time period from the 60s through the present day. And I'd kind of come across Democratic policy in passing, and I wanted to unify it and look at the Obama administration. And since the 1970s, the Democratic Party's had a strong grassroots base growing out of the anti-war movement of the Vietnam era. It had far fewer people, particularly in the Obama administration, with a Pentagon or defense background. Recall that Bill Clinton's last defense secretary was a Republican. And sure enough, when Obama took office, he appointed as his defense secretary Robert Gates, who was Bush's final defense secretary. And that a couple of the other leading jobs in the Obama administration went to career military people. General Jones, who was the National Security Advisor, Dennis Blair, who was in charge of the intelligence community, for top jobs in his administration. So you have a Democratic president, but without the same kind of cohort of people that the Republicans represented. And the Democrats, over the years, since Vietnam, have been struggling with issues, precisely the ones that the Republicans took for granted. Is America a force for good in the world? When is it? And is everything that the United States does overseas in some way doomed or malign? And certainly at the grassroots of the party, you get debates about whether the use of force is ever justified. So I tend to think of the Obama administration, when it took office in 2009, as confronting what I call the legacy of the two Georges. And the first George, of course, is George W. Bush. Obama needed to figure out what he was going to do in the wake of the Bush presidency. The other George, less obvious, would be George McGovern. the Republicans, ever since the George McGovern campaign of 1972, there's been kind of a Republican trope that that Republicans can fall back on it at election time, even when it's not necessarily true, that the Democrats are weak on defense. And the fact that this is not true shows up over and over again. At the time of the Persian Gulf War, the shock and awe of American high-tech weaponry that we saw at the beginning of that war actually was developed in the late 1970s in the Pentagon of Jimmy Carter under a guy with a high-tech background named William Perry. The Democrats and Republicans have both been familiar with issues of the use of force, and it's not a black and white Democrats weak on defense issue. And so the problem in writing this book was the Vulcans had all worked alongside one another in one administration after another. When I began talking to the Obama foreign policy team, one of the most surprising things I found was the underlying generational tensions. To be specific, the Obamians thought of themselves as a new generation. And when I stepped back, I realized that in this Obama administration, there are really three different generations of Democrats, each with its own formative experiences, each with its own background, and with different generational perspectives. So let me look for a moment at these three generations. The first is the post-Vietnam generation of officials and political leaders who came of age in the 70s and 80s, even the 60s in the case of the late Richard Holbrooke. But it's people like Holbrooke, Joe Biden, the Secretary of Defense, George Mitchell, who was the Middle East peace envoy, Greg Craig. I would call John Kerry, who is not in the administration, but chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and certainly the administration's strongest supporter in Congress, certainly a charter member of this Vietnam generation. This does not mean that all the members of this administration are anti-war Democrats. Holbrooke, in particular, had repeatedly, at each juncture where there was an anti-war candidate, he tended to be with the centrist and to denounce the anti-war candidate. That was true of McGovern. It was true of Obama, and so on. But more than any other generation, these members of this first generation have seen firsthand how the use of force can go disastrously wrong, and it's something that they keep in mind regularly. And this is a dominant issue for the Democrats right through till the Persian Gulf War of 1991, when the Democrats predict inaccurately, as it turns out, that there are going to be tens of thousands of casualties. That wasn't some flippant thing by some minor politician. I mean, the Senate Majority Leader, George Mitchell, presented President George H.W. Bush with a petition by leading members of Congress saying, don't go to war because there could be tens of thousands of casualties. And soon, Bill Clinton takes office, and you get what amounts to a second generation of Democrats. The Clinton generation, I've called them the trout fishers, because there were after Clinton left office, some of these officials began spending time with each other, like they like to go trout fishing together. These are officials like Tom Donilon, now the National Security Advisor, Jim Steinberg, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, Kurt Campbell, who is the State Department's and Hillary Clinton's point man for Asia, and a whole wave of other officials. And they had a different perspective. I mean,